Okay, so I thought I'd do a quick video on sand cores. And so what are sand cores? Well, if you're going to cast say a sword, in your head, think about a sword. It's more or less a flat blade with a bit that sticks out where the handle's going to be. You can carve two cavities and two halves in the mold, pour the liquid bronze in between, and then just open the mold, and you're more or less done, right? But if you want to do something like a spearhead, right? And I didn't have anything at hand other than this handle off one of my angle grinders. But if you want to cast a piece that has a hole or a cavity in it like this, where the shaft of the spear, the handle really can go in, well, with modern tools, you could, of course, just drill and ream that out. But if you wanted to cast that like that, how do you make that cavity in the casting? And the way they used to do it, way back when, was to use what they called sand cores. And assuming that you're casting your piece in sand, so a sand mold, you need to create sand that is, how do you do that? Well, not create sand, but create a mixture of sand that will stand up to the rigors of the molding and then come out at the end. So, and what you want is some kind of mixture of sand and other substances that will extend into the cavity inside the mold such that the bronze flows around it without cooling too quickly. And the end result being that once everything is cooled, you can take that sand core out and you've got the space in there for the handle of the tool or the spear or whatever it is you're making. Now, how do you make that? Well, this is an example of a sand core, and it's got a little bit of a problem there. I didn't ram the sand down quite tight enough, but this is, and you'll see as well, I've added just a metal shaft down the middle to give it a bit more rigidity as it extends into the cavity in the mold. But what I've done is and so I've experimented a bit. I've gone online, of course. I've looked at all different kinds of recipes, really, for sand cores, ways of making them. Some of you might be wondering, well, just use sodium silicate, which is also called water glass. And it's a way of, basically, it's a liquid with silicate in it, dissolved into it. And you soak the sand in the sodium silicate, and then you blow force carbon dioxide through it, and it becomes virtually rock hard, which is amazing. But part of me wanted to experiment with technologies that they would have had back in the Bronze Age, materials that they would have had back in the Bronze Age to accomplish the same task. And some of the recipes I came across did not involve sodium silicate. They involved things like, of course, just regular sand as a base, and then a bit of flour or some kind of organic compound powder, and then liquid sugar, or molasses, in fact, or honey in some cases. And the idea being that you mix this all together. It smells delicious, by the way. And then you bake it. And as you bake it, it drives out the moisture. And the sugar and the flour and all those sorts of materials result in a very durable and hard solid, basically. And so this is basically made of sand. There's a bit of a flaw there. I didn't pack the sand down enough when I made it, but live and learn, right? But this is sand core. Now, I've added a little metal core down the center of it to give it extra rigidity and strength. But this, and I've already tried this once or twice, will stand up to the initial, heat and pressure of bronze flowing around it. And then as the bronze cools, of course, it starts to burn out the organic material, the flour. And when you take the piece out of the mold, instead of having to chip away at the stuff that's in the hole, it virtually just comes out like powder. So it's really kind of a win-win, I thought. And again, in terms of historical accuracy or historical methods, people in the Bronze Age would have had honey or molasses or different kinds of sugar. They would have had sand and flour and water. So I thought that was a useful solution. And that's what I'm going to show you today, is how I make one of these after, again, a whole lot of experimentation and trying to mix and match recipes I found online. So one of these sand cores, of course, the shape of the cavity inside, and I'll just keep saying a spear, but for argument's sake, it could be an axe or any kind of tool, really, but I'll say a spear. you know, the shape of the cavity inside the haft or the handle of the spear isn't going to be a cylinder like this. But one of the benefits of this material, once it's been baked properly, etc., is that you can not carve it like a knife, but you can certainly grind it down to shape so that the part that's left as it sticks into the cavity in the mold will create the right shape inside the piece you're making. So how do I do that? So how do I start with one of these sand core, I don't know, I'll call them a sand core blank. Well, I took an aluminum tube, cut it down the middle as best I could, and that will be the form for our mold. Now what I'll do is I'll put some of these hose clamps on to hold it and orient it properly, and then I'll place one of these little rods down the middle. I showed you in the piece earlier how I wanted to put a metal core down the middle to give it extra strength. I'll put that in the center, keep it there carefully, and then I'll mix together the sand and the molasses water, the sand and the flour, and the water and the molasses, pack that around the core. Okay, so the first step, of course, is to mix up your core sand. And this is already, I've got some fine silica sand here, and I guess you can tell where I shop, but the proportions are 16 parts sand to 1 part flour. So 17 parts, 16 of them are the sand, 1 part is the flour. And I'll mix in, or rather put in my container here, about enough to fill the tube I showed you earlier. That should be enough, yeah. And then what I do is I mix in, as I said, some of the water molasses mixture. And for molasses, I splurged. I bought the fancy molasses. Now, as far as I know, there's no difference there. But again, I guess you can tell where I shop. Just regular molasses from the grocery store, and I mixed in some water. And again, coincidentally or otherwise, the mixture I found, or the proportions I found to work, were 16 parts water to 1 part molasses. So again, 17 parts total, 16 water, 1 part molasses. And I think it may ferment a little in the bottle, but so I'll just add a little bit of that to start. Not too much. And you're just going to start mixing that together. I just grabbed a piece of copper to do this with. And you're going to mix and mix and mix and mix and mix. And there's probably a more sensible way to do this, just to get a nice even mixture. But and it starts getting goopy, kind of like little lumps. But as you work at it and work at it, it gets more even, more consistent. And I'll come back in a few minutes when you know, it's a little bit closer to the consistency we need. Okay, so as I said a second ago, I've carefully lined up the 2 halves of the split pipe I made, and I put some hose clamps on, 3, 2, whatever, just as long as it doesn't shift much while you're packing it, because you're going to try to pack the sand down inside with a reasonable amount of force. I said I usually put a little metal rod down the middle to help add rigidity and strength, and one of the ways I keep it centered at the bottom so it doesn't drift as you're packing it is I just set a washer on the table, slightly shorter diameter than the bottom so it doesn't get stuck there. And then I will, as I said, set that rod in the middle. And then really, the next step is to just start packing the sand in. The sand, what you want, it's not quite the same as, say, green sand, if you're familiar with that term. You want it to sort of keep a little bit of its shape. Not a problem if your fingers get all gross, but you don't want it oozing moisture as you squeeze it. So moist, but not too moist. I know that's a very subjective thing, but so then you just start packing it in around the core, the little core you've put in. And every couple of amounts, you give it a little tamp, pack it down some. Because what you're trying to do is get nice, tight, solidly packed sand all the way down. Sorry, I'm making a terrible mess here, and I know I'm putting my hand in the way so you can't quite see what I'm doing. I'm right-handed, I'm sorry about that. So there, I've packed that in a little more, so put more in, so now I'm going to pack it down some more. And then you just keep going until you get to the top. So I'll just keep putting more and more in, packing it down every few handfuls, or I guess not really properly handfuls, but every little bit. Word to the wise, by the way, make this, you know, your core sand up as you go for each job. If you leave it with the molasses and everything in the sand in a container for very long, it just gets moldy. You know, it's a great medium for bacteria and mold and all that kind of thing. So make it as you go. Do that, we'll give it another tamping here. suppose sodium silica doesn't mold, so that's one of the points in its favor. But again, this is the method I chose to go with. And so when you get to the top, you just kind of smooth it off or level it off. Let's see how the bottom looks. Oh, there, see the little washer came right out. That looks pretty good too. And ideally, if I've done a good job, this is evenly packed all the way down. And you might just clean up some of the just extra bits on the ends. But the next step is for this whole thing, just as is, because it's all metal and then sand and the organics inside, to go in the oven. And again, there's no magic with this next step. It just goes into the oven, or a toaster oven in this case, in 400 degrees Fahrenheit for a couple hours. Okay, so it's been about an hour. Let's have a look in here. And yep, it looks exactly like it did an hour ago. Not that there's any visual cue really to be had by looking at it. You just need to bake it for like 2 or 3 hours, and that should do it. Okay, I'm going to close it up again. So I had the first one in the toaster oven over there. I rammed up a second one. It's a little bit longer than the first, about the same diameter. It's also got the metal core down the middle for added strength and rigidity. One small experiment I am doing with this one is I lined the inside of the tube with parchment paper, just like out of your kitchen. I don't know if that'll do any good. My hope is that it will help, the sand core release a little bit from the two halves of the pipe. Occasionally it can get because again, molasses and all that kind of thing, it can get very stuck to the inside. Eventually it comes away, but you always feel weird because it can seem so delicate. You don't want to damage the sand core and that sort of thing. But I'll let you know how that turns out using the parchment paper on the inside. Smells delicious. Like I said, with the molasses in there, it's got a quite pleasant smell, like some kind of I don't know, tart or cookie or something. Just a warning again, word to the wise, there are a few recipes out there online that involve oil instead of molasses as a kind of a binder for the sand core. Those, when you put them in the oven, do tend to smell quite terrible. So if you've got a toaster oven in the shop like this, go for it, but do not do it in the house. You will upset your wife or your husband or your spouse or your roommates or anybody else that lives in the house. Good morning. Well, it's morning for me. It's the next day. I let the two sand cores cool overnight. And I think I've saved some time. I've unscrewed these hose clamps. And we'll now try. Like I said, sometimes it can be very, very sticky to get them apart. Oh, that came apart pretty well, actually. Let me just see what happens here now. Super easy, actually. So occasionally you get the little lines on either side of your sand core, which maybe you want to get rid of. But like I said, you can sort of shape these a little bit. So I just usually hit them with a bit of sandpaper just to take those lines off so they're less obvious. Although in theory they'll be on the inside of your casting, so they won't be visible anyways, but still, just the same. So that worked out pretty well. So that's nice and solid. I don't know if you can hear that, but it's a good solid one, again with the steel down the middle to give it a little bit of rigidity. And what I'll probably do later is take this over to the belt grinder and shape it. So it'll be the inside of in fact what I'm going to be casting is a Sauroter, sort of the butt spike on a Greek hoplite spear, a dory. And so I'll want to carve that into the shape of that space. The experiment I did, the slightly longer one, you can see it's longer, with the parchment paper also worked pretty well. Also worked, it popped out even easier. Sorry, it's already out, but even easier, more easily out of the pipe. The only dodgy bit here, you see this line here, that's not actually a crack, that's just where the paper bunched up a bit inside as I was tamping it down. And some of the paper has still, well, I guess I could probably peel that off, stuck to the sand itself. Although if you imagine this extending into the mold space, the cavity in the mold, part of this sand core has to be held in place by the mold itself. So what I'll do is I'll carve this end to shape and just use this bit as the anchoring part of the sand core. Anyways, I'm happy with both of those. They'll both get used, maybe even later today. Thanks for watching. There'll be another video in a little bit about casting, as I say, that Sauroter. Take care. So I mentioned that I was going to cast a Sauroter later today. Again, a Sauroter is kind of the butt spike that goes on the bottom end of a Greek dory or spear that the hoplites used to use. This is the pattern I put together or made up for casting that. This is the piece that makes the cavity in the sand mold. Just turned it on a lathe, cleaned it up. It was already split in two. But you'll notice, let's put it back together here, the end piece that I want to create is only this portion. So this would be the end of the piece, and then the handle of the spear would slide in, or ideally that's what I'm aiming for. The reason this extra bit here, this extension here, exists is to, again, create part of the cavity in the sand to help line up the sand, or the sand core. So you'll notice that's the same diameter. I'll grind this down so it's more tapered, kind of like the shape of the Sauroter here. And ideally, it will extend, perhaps that far up into the actual cavity in the mold, and then the bronze will flow all around it in the shape of, fingers crossed, this pattern. So more on that in the next video.